The Oklahoma governor's education secretary is calling to take away the teaching license of a public high school teacher who quit her job in opposition to House Bill 1775, a state law that bans certain race and gender concepts from schools. The teacher, Summer Boismere, reportedly helped students apply for library cards so that they could read banned books. Boismere has received many different threats from the right throughout the situation, according to Jacobin. So here's a story where we had one of these conservative bans on literature, preventing people in schools from teaching this. Apparently this teacher let kids know how they could, use the public resources of the library to go ahead and just get a library card and read whatever they wanted to read. And now her job is being threatened by the Oklahoma Education board member.
I think this story is being misrepresented a little bit. So the Oklahoma law specifically is mostly about preventing not literature, or it doesn't mention critical race theory. What it prevents is the teaching that it prohibits teaching discriminatory concepts or treating people in a discriminatory way. You can't claim in the teaching that you are responsible for let me finish. Is that you are responsible because of your race or gender, that you are responsible for what happened to other people, what people of the same race or gender did historically. It's trying to prevent generational, racial, and gender-based guilt. Now, this is probably not a structured law, so I get that it's not a good idea, fine. It doesn't specifically, based on my reading of it, mean you have to do anything whatsoever with the books in the library. That was the school officials' decision, that they wanted to panic and start taking books out of the library. This librarian made a very public show of resisting that, fine, and so this happened. But, I don't think the law is a great idea, but it doesn't specifically say they have to take the books on the shelf. That's just how everybody acted.
I'm so glad you said that, because that is exactly the point. That a lot of these laws don't have specific language that says you cannot teach the bluest eye, or any number of books that happen to accurately portray the fact that
no one told her to take bluest eye off the shelf.
Until recent history, until my mother was, in elementary school, she did not live in a country where she had equal rights under the law. So I don't know about generational trauma, but there are many teachers of an age where, they certainly personally experience the inequities of the American judicial system. And now we're talking about the fact that people aren't even able to assign books that happen to reflect the reality of what this country was like until very recently. So this teacher was constrained under the law, regardless of what the text of the law. The law is being used as the excuse, as the hook for constraining her ability to teach students as she would like.
It sounds to me like she was constrained by school officials who misread the law.
Yes, but that is the entire point, Robby, that these laws are intentionally written to give people this kind of power. And I think people should be concerned if they do, in fact, object to the underlying censorship here, that they should not defend laws that are being used as tools for said censorship. Moreover, what this teacher ultimately did was simply let kids know that they could avail themselves of a publicly available resource in the form of a library card. And now that teacher is being doubly censored for simply pointing to the existence of a public resource. This seems like it's an outrage and should be very much the focus of a lot of public concern about the scourge of censorship that's happening in the United States of America.
I don't think we should take books out of the library, whether it's the bluest eye or J.K. Rowling or whatever, for any reason. I agree. But this law, for the reasons you're bringing up, is not a good idea, but it literally does not tell them they have to do this.
And yet censorship is happening. Twitter doesn't say MAGA not allowed, and yet there's a lot of concerns about the disproportionate censorship that happens on these platforms. And it is very curious to me why there aren't more alarm bells ringing about actual teachers being forbidden from not even teaching books.
I mean, there are alarm bells ringing. This is a big story. The ACLU is suing. This is getting tons of attention.
The teacher couldn't even point to the idea that there is a library card. I mean, imagine the limits of the constraints of speech here are so far and beyond what you normally even experience in these kind of circumstances. People can quibble over whether they think this book or that book is right for teaching. I have been having robust conversations recently with a friend of mine who's a teacher who's, shares my values and my political values, but is very much wrestling with what kinds of materials are age appropriate for students of certain ages and certain themes. These are conversations that happen across, in pedagogical circles, regardless of your political orientation. orientation. But to be at a place where you can't even allow kids to know that they can go to the public library.
Okay, but those conversations are happening in pedagogical circumstances, and some parents don't like that those conversations are happening without, or feel like those conversations were happening without parental input, and the parents are now having their input, and they don't agree in some cases, in some jurisdictions, with the school district or the boards of the teachers.
I'm talking about the fact that teachers in the course of planning their jobs are deciding what their curriculars are going to be.
When you said what's appropriate for children.
Yeah.
Right.
They're not talking about whether or not there's some sexual content or something like that. They're just trying to put their course materials together. Just like anybody in the course of their job plans what they're going to talk about in any course of day. They're trying to figure out whether kids are mature enough to handle heavy themes, real themes, like racism, which exists in this country. Which I'm sorry, like you can't sit here and say you want to teach kids. So many of the conservatives sit here and claim, oh, we're not trying to, prevent people from teaching real history. But there's all of this worminess about the reality that we had a Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act, and it wasn't the Civil Rights Act of 1864. It's the Civil Rights Act of this past century. A Civil Rights Act that gave many people, I'm sorry, I'm now being forced into this situation where I have to accuse everything of being race. I wouldn't have to talk about race if people didn't spend so much time trying to pretend that the very recent history of this country didn't exist. So here's a librarian. We don't even know if this was racially motivated or what the content was. All we know is that this teacher said, you can go to the library and check out books. And we live in such a authoritarian landscape where these conservatives, many conservatives, not all conservatives, are pushing forward the level of laws that make it so that a teacher who simply references the fact that there's a public resource in the form of a library and that kids can go get a library card is being pushed out of her job.
The entity that said, take the books off the shelves, or this is pretty Orwellian, or turn them around so people can't see them on the shelves.
It's ridiculous.
But it wasn't Republican lawmakers who said that, or this law. It was the school officials.
And to your point,
and that was wrong. And that was wrong.
Point, so many
they should
of
not
these
have
school
done
boards
that.
have been overwhelmed by, conservatives who have been empowered by these kinds of laws, which are absolutely coming down on the state and federal level. These are being pushed across the country. And there is very little pushback. Very little pushback from people who say that they care about free speech absolutism. And it really undermines the credibility of what I think should be a robust interest in protecting free speech.
Tons of pushback, Brianna. Tons of pushback.
Well, I'm certainly experiencing tons of pushback in the context of this conversation.
I have yet to defend a single one of these laws. They're all bad. All bad. We have another story, actually, and a similar-ish theme, so we're going to talk about it in this same video. An LA high school newspaper advisor is facing suspension after her students reported on an unvaccinated librarian last November. They published a story in their high school newspaper naming faculty member Greta Enzer, who had refused to comply with the district's vaccine mandate, the LA Times reported, in December. So she asked the newspaper advisor to remove her name from the story, citing HIPAA, which prevents medical professionals from revealing patients' records without their consent. Although this sounds more like it'd be a FERPA case than a HIPAA case.
Well, the Times says the students reached out to the Student Press Law Center and were told by an attorney they were in their rights to keep Esner's name in their story. They then told Esner that they would not be removing her name. This piece led to a battle over censorship as the LA Unified School District now seeks to take disciplinary action against the student's journalism advisor. The Times writes that editorial content at this high school newspaper is controlled by the students. So here we go. It's an instance where a woman, a teacher, opted not to get vaccinated. Apparently, there was a very small number of teachers that this was back when there were a lot of vaccine mandates. This was in the fall of 2021. This was an older story. At which point, the students of the school paper reported apparently pretty accurately on this. They're award-winning, apparently local high school paper that are subject to the same kind of protections as broader media institutions outside of a high school context. The teacher, the person who didn't want to get vaccinated, asked that her name be pulled from the paper. The students defended their rights, their First Amendment rights, to report accurately on what happened, and apparently they're being backed up by some of the legal authority in the state. And yet now the teacher's journalism advisor, who's backing the kids up and their right to go ahead and keep this person's name in there, is now having their job threatened as well.
I'm a free speech absolutist. I agree. They should be able to write that story and have her name in there, and they should not and cannot be punished for it. I don't know actually what like the Supreme Court would say about this, because past Supreme Court decisions have been much less favorable to high school students' free speech rights than college students' free speech rights. I'm not saying I agree with those decisions. That's just unfortunately been the reality. There's a lot of what kind of political armbands you can wear and political messages you can have, all that kind of stuff. So it's from my standpoint, I think it is actually a little bit muddled from a First Amendment perspective. That said, as a free speech absolutist, it's a public school. If it's a public school, then yes, they should, in their role as journalists, be able to write stories, even, I guess, if they're unflattering to teachers. I can see how this you can imagine a world or edge cases, right, where this starts to get quite disrupt. What if they're just writing really nasty hit pieces about teachers they don't like? Like, it could break down a little bit.
I think that's a really good point. Whatever your principles are with respect to free speech, I think a lot of these conversations miss the humanity in it all. And people might be surprised that I might defend the person who didn't want to get vaccinated. But the reality is, I don't like the idea of her being kind of the focus of a fear campaign or a program at the school to try to pressure her to change her behavior. If she doesn't want to get vaccinated, that is what it is. And whatever mandates were in effect may or may not have an effect on her ability to continue working there. I mean, obviously, this was in the past, and those mandates are no longer in effect. But, we live in a part of a community. And I do think that sometimes having these hard principles that everybody defends on the internet, ignore the fact that if we want to have the best community we want, and we don't want to have teachers and students at each other's throats and communities being ripped apart by these kinds of things, then there's sometimes a way to behave with a little bit more grace than either side has been necessarily.
If I was their journalism advisor, I might very well have told them to leave the name out of the story, or looked at whether that was possible. And in fact, sometimes I do, even when I write on things I feel are important and socially valuable and need to be written about, sometimes I leave names out of stories, even if I'm criticizing the person, because in today's day and age, with Google search results, you can really wreck someone's life more than they deserve, more than whatever the criticism, whatever the legitimate point is, the news value of it, and you're harming them beyond the news value. And so you make editorial calls like that, and it wouldn't be wrong to think about it, but from a legal standpoint, they ought to have the right. I'm not sure they do, but they ought to have the right.
Well, this is fascinating stuff. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.